Hi, this is the Better Relationships Through Research podcast, and I'm your host, Daniel Dashnaw, marriage and family therapist. In this episode, I've got the privilege of speaking with Erica Komisar, a seasoned psychoanalyst, parent coach, and author dedicated to helping families thrive emotionally. We'll explore Erica's unique insights into the critical early years of child development, the growing epidemic of adolescent anxiety, and how modern stressors are reshaping family dynamics. I've worked with families and couples from diverse backgrounds, and that's how I found Erica's focus on emotional attunement to be really practical, research based strategies. Whether you're a parent, a therapist, or just someone trying to strengthen your family connections, I'm hoping this conversation will offer some valuable advice. What I think you might want to learn this episode is why being emotionally present during early years of a child's life really matters, and how to identify and address signs of anxiety in adolescence. What are the influences of societal pressures on family dynamics and resilience? Practical steps parents can take. We'd all like to know some of those. I want to tell you about my guest. Dr. Erica Komisar is a clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, parent coach. She's got more than 30 years of experience. She's the author of Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters, and Chicken Little, The Sky Isn't Raising Resilient Adolescents in the New Age of Anxiety. Erica's work has been featured in publications like the Wall Street Journal and Thrive Global, where she offers evidence-based advice for parents navigating the challenges of modern family life. I'm Daniel Dashnaw, marriage and family therapist, and I'm excited to be able to offer you this podcast and this discussion. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Very nice to meet you. Could you tell me a little bit about your journey into psychoanalysis and what drew you to focus on family and parenting as a specialty?
Well, I was a social worker before I was a psychoanalyst, and I worked in a clinic in Brooklyn for 4 years, and I started doing parenting classes, what we call psychoeducational. I was treating families, foster families, grandparents raising children, parents raising children. And, I was finding that in treating the children, what was missing is that many of the parents didn't have sort of basic parenting skills. And so that's how I started doing parenting classes. And then I took that into the corporate world. And so that's sort of how I got into parent education and parent guidance work. In terms of psychoanalysis, you could say it's a family business. I have a sister who's an analyst and a brother-in-law, and so I knew about it from a very young age. But I also knew that it was you'd say the terminal degree in the field of talk therapy, meaning the deepest understanding of the human psyche, going back to its very origins, and not just in a superficial or environmental way, but also in an internal way. So, psychoanalysts don't just look at the environment. So, as a social worker, we always looked at the environment, and the environment is parenting, which is very important. And all the stress that we faced and adversity we face and trauma we've faced, and that's all environmental, much of it, but also one's internal state, one's fantasy life, one's unconscious. And so, as an analyst, I was interested in both one's interior and the exterior. And then I started to write the books that I do because as I started to practice outside of the clinic on my own in my private practice, what I was seeing is that there was an uptick in mental illness in children and adolescents, the likes of which we had never seen as clinicians. Um, Children were being diagnosed right and left with ADHD and behavioral problems and being medicated at a very young age inappropriately. And so, what I was seeing in my practice is that those children who were really struggling had one thing in common, and that was that they didn't have very present primary attachment figures, either their mothers or their fathers, whoever was their primary attachment figure, usually their mother, was either very intensely a career person and not at home with them. So they were either in daycare or being raised by nannies. or they had mothers who were physically at home, but who were either depressed or checked out emotionally. And so, yeah, I started looking at the research in attachment theory and psychoanalysis and neuroscience and epigenetics. And, I found all of the research, a great deal of research that backed up what I was seeing, which is that mothers are not just emotionally a nicety for children in the first critical period of brain development, but they're actually biologically necessary in the first 3 years if you want your children to be mentally healthy in the future. So, I wanted to write a book, and I did about 13 years of looking at all the research in these fields. And then I waited till my own children were older. So I wouldn't be neglecting my own children to write a book, which would have been narcissistic. And then when my children were older, I waited.
Mm,
And then when my children were older, I wrote Being There,
yes.
which caused a lot of controversy because women took it as an anti-feminist book, which it was not. It's just a research-based book on a science-based book on what are the irreducible needs of children. And then later I wrote Chicken Little, which was about the second critical period of brain development, which is adolescence, right? So we say the first critical period of brain development, neurogenesis is going on, right? There's tremendous cell growth. So by 3 years of age, 85% of a child's social emotional brain is developed, which means that if you're not there, that brain isn't developing in the same way.
And what happens to the attachment style if that's
Right.
the case?
So attachment security is critical to mental health. And so if you don't have attachment security by a year, the longitudinal research shows that you're probably not going to have it 20 years later. And that the correlation between attachment insecurity and mental illness is great. And that means that if you have an attachment disorder because you did not have a present primary attachment figure, physically and emotionally present, you're likely to develop an attachment disorder, which is then correlated with things like depression, anxiety, and borderline personality disorder.
What struck me about your work is you were fearlessly sort of like, traipsing into a cultural sort of conundrum. On the one hand, capitalism wants women to get educations, and be workers, and they try to have very enlightened policies towards that end. But along comes you and the pitiless research that you have that says, "No, wait a minute, those first 3 years are determinative, they're so fundamental, they're so essential." And our cultural norms, which, you know, tip our hat, so to speak, towards mom being with the child, doesn't address the fact that this should be going on for 36 months.
Well, I sort of compare what I do to like people who are climate change deniers. You
That's a
know,
good
yeah,
analogy. Say
you know,
more.
as what did Al Gore say? The inconvenient truth. You can deny it all you want; it doesn't make it not true. And so, yeah, you're right. It is pitiless research that is an inconvenient truth, which is that if you are not there physically and emotionally, and you're not present enough in those first 3 years, those children have to develop pathological defenses for the most part to cope with that loss. And many of those defenses will make that child appear as if they're doing okay. But the key word there is appear. So many of the children that appear as if they're doing okay actually form personalities that are defensive personalities, but inside those children don't have the ego strength and the resilience and the ability to cope with things like stress and adversity, and they're not capable of regulating their emotions in the future. And it's why I believe why we're seeing this great uptick in mental disorders in children, meaning a lot of the things that children are exposed to are stressful. And you could say they're more stressful than in my generation. I'm 60. So, whatever was going on for us, which was also stressful, the threat of nuclear war and nuclear power plants, melting down and the end of Vietnam for me and, the Russian threat and then Iraq and on and on and on. So we had our own stresses.
Right.
And, we didn't have social media. It's true. We didn't have the technology, but these are all just adversities. So, and we're not going to change a lot of these stressors. There's always going to be technology. The cat is out of the bag. We may be able to pull back social media, but we're not going to be able to take phones away from kids or computers or video games. We're not going to remove all the stressors. So, what that means is that you need to reinforce children even more to feel secure in the face of these stressors.
But maybe also have some agency as well in the face of those stressors. Like, for example, how does a parent not only identify that their teen is anxious, but how do they intervene in a situation like that?
Well, so what we know from the research is that many children are born what we call neurologically fragile. They're born sensitive, and there is a sensitivity gene. There's no gene for mental
Is
illness.
this like HSP concept by the Aarons that they came up
It's
with, that
it's
framework?
it has to do
Highly
with
sensitive?
serotonin reception. So
Ah,
it's
yes.
lock on serotonin. So basically, the concept is these children who are born neurologically sensitive, and there's been a gene discovered for this sensitivity, are more sensitive to stress, therefore more inclined to mental illness. And those children, the research says, if those children with that particular sensitivity gene, if they are provided with sensitive empathic nurturing in the early years by a primary attachment figure, it neutralizes the expression of that gene. It's epigenetics. So, meaning we're all born with a genetic makeup, but our genes don't necessarily get expressed. And so
Right.
the expression of those genes means that those children are more inclined to anxiety and depression and personality disorders. So, that was a very important piece of research because it says that those children are even more in need of parental presence, right? And those children, what does that look like? They're harder to soothe. They handle separation less well. They're more fractious when you leave them or separate from them. They may not sleep as well. They don't do well when they're away from your body. They may have eating issues, sleeping issues. So, those children that we call neurologically sensitive, who are sensitive to everything in the environment, sounds, smells, touch. And when you have a sensitive child, right? And
Right,
a lot of pediatricians call it colic. I'm like, every child has digestive immaturity. That would
right.
make you don't develop, your digestive system doesn't develop till you're 3 months of age. So if you tell every parent their child has colic, every baby has digestive immaturity. So
Right.
it's more neurological sensitivity.
You see that later, right? Which is why you wrote Chicken Little about the
Yeah.
adolescent anxiety piece. What were the trends in your practice that made you feel that that follow-up distinction book was necessary on top of being there?
Well, my intention was always to write that second book. You
Okay,
couldn't put everything in one book because there are different periods of development, right? So there are two critical periods of development. So again, neurogenesis is when the brain is growing like crazy. And
right.
you could say like a garden that overgrows.
Mhm.
And then adolescence is the period of pruning where you cut back the cells, you cut back the garden, and that's just as important as the cell growth. So when you have an overgrown garden, the brain doesn't function properly. So, yeah, both of these periods, the first critical period and the second critical period. So, my intention was always to write two books to say to parents, these are two periods of development where the environment matters a great deal, and you are the environment. Now, when you have an adolescent, there are other aspects of the environment, right? When you have an infant, you are primarily their entire world. You are
Right,
their environment. When you have an adolescent, you are still a great part of that environment, but they have other things. They have school, they have friends, right? So they're
right.
out in the world. So, what I say to parents is if you miss the first window, you have another chance. In fact, the book's name that I gave it that they changed because they always change the names of my books.
Huh, yeah.
Yeah, the name of the book was Second Chances. And the name of being there was The Lost Instinct.
Hmm.
that they changed to being there. So,
It's ironic because I don't know if you know about another book called Being There. It was a novel written in
yeah,
1970.
Jersey Kaczynski, you're talking about
Yes,
Jersey Kaczynski.
Kaczynski.
Oh, yeah. I mean, forever, people would look up my book and they'd find Jersey
Yes,
Kaczynski.
I figured you would encounter that.
Yes.
Are you
For a long
familiar?
for a long time, you had to write "Being There, Erica," and then you'd come up with my book. If you even
Oh,
put
really?
my name in, yeah. But now, actually, I'm happy to say, because I've gotten some sort of recognition for my work, if you put in "Being There," half of the time you're gonna get my book and not Jersey Kaczynski, so
Uh,
that's a good thing.
what's
No,
ironic.
really arrived when Jersey Kaczynski is really doesn't come up at all.
Yes, that's how you're measuring your
That's
success with
how I
the
measure
book.
my
That's funny.
success in
Yeah.
getting my message out, yeah.
What's ironic about this notion is I'm very familiar with that novel.
Yeah,
It is about a man who never was raised by parents and
yes,
somehow as an infant winds up, like, neglected and finds meaning in life in a garden and
that's right.
says all these cryptic, sort of, like, seemingly profound things and winds up becoming, I guess, an advisor to the president by a series of happenstance accidents. Uh,
Yeah.
but what was interesting about that was the notion of he was unshaped by human hands. And your book talks about what happens when you don't do that, and when you do, they'll do that well with skill. So that takes me back to this notion of resilience, which is not a factor with an infant, but is so much a factor with a teen. How can parents reinforce an awareness of resilience as a quality to cultivate for teens?
So people don't really understand what resilience means. Resilience is the capacity to cope with stress and adversity. And what we know from research is that the capacity to cope with stress has a great deal to do with being buffered from stress in the early years. Meaning the stress regulating part of the brain is meant to remain offline and rather quiet for the first year, and then another 2 years only incrementally exposed to stress. So what we're doing to our kids is throwing them into these incredibly stressful situations where their brains just go into, like, the HVA axis. They go into fight or flight mode at the youngest of ages, right? We know that ADHD is nothing more. It's not a disorder. It is a stress response to the flight response of human beings feeling threatened. So when babies feel completely lost and frightened and threatened by the absence of the one person in the world who provide them with a sense of security, they're going to either get very aggressive and start biting and hitting people, or they're going to start to be distracted, and that's what's happening to our kids. But resilience is not something kids are born with, and it is something that's built on security, love, attention, dependency. So independence is really based on dependency, right? So the idea that children feel safely dependent on the person in the world who's providing them with that safety is what resilience is based on. It is the incremental exposure, call it exposure therapy over a very long period of time, slow exposure therapy to frustration and stress. But if you expose your children to too much stress, too much expectation and projection of self sufficiency and independence too young, then you build a house of cards that falls down with the first wind. The three little pigs, the house made of hay versus the house made of brick.
So you're talking about eustress versus distress.
Yeah.
A
Yeah. So,
stressful how can parents create or support these types of ordinary developmental eustress experiences for their
well, you
children?
don't have to, because they just exist naturally. When a baby cries, you can't always get there immediately. You try to, right? But maybe the baby is for 30 seconds or a minute, crying, and you go and pick them up, right? If you run to the bathroom and the baby is, starting to fuss, there's the beginning of, or if a baby is wet and it takes you a minute to change them, there is natural occurring organic amounts of stress and frustration. You don't have to introduce them to stress. Stress just exists, right? Frustration exists. So, but what we're doing to them is creating these terribly stressful situations where they are literally with strangers, away from the only person that they know that provides them with that security. And that then their part of their brain that's meant to remain quiet is being turned on too early. So what can parents do?
Yeah, what can they
Yeah,
do?
in childhood and adolescence, the idea is that parents can provide their children with sensitive, empathic nurturing throughout childhood, not just 0 to 3, also in adolescence. There's a lot of books now, and my friend Jonathan Haidt
Oh, yes.
and the Let Grow founder and Lenore Skenazy, all these people talk about, oh, we are not letting our children be free roaming, be independent. And they are correct that we have reversed development. We treat very young children under the age of 3 as if they're much older than they are and can handle more than they can. And then we treat much older children as if they're much younger.
Why do you suppose we do that?
Well, I think that parents feel guilty that they haven't been able to be with their much younger children, either physically, emotionally, or both. And so then they fuss over their older children in a way, and also sort of the idea that they can control every aspect of their child's distress later in life, which is so ironic for me because they don't seem to care, many parents, about the distress of their very young children, but then they care deeply about the distress of their older children. So what we really want to balance this out is we want to treat very young children as if they're fragile, and therefore treat them as if they're fragile and only introduce frustration incrementally, and then when they get older, allow them to experience disappointment, rejection. These things are naturally occurring. You don't get the
Right,
part in the school play. You don't get to be the pitcher on the baseball team.
right.
You don't get into the high school you want to get into. You don't get into the college you want to get into. There is naturally occurring disappointment and rejection and adversity in children's lives that you have to help children to process, but not to remove, right? We don't want to remove all stress and frustration from their lives, but we do want to help them cope with it, right? And there was an analogy, I think it was my rabbi used it, or some religious figure said, I think it was my rabbi said that, there are different versions of God, but my version of God is that, you know, it's not that God is there to protect you from all adversity, but when you do have adversity, boy, it's great to have that figure help you through that adversity. And so that's the way I think about what children need to experience to develop a psychic immune system, right? But the other thing is that parents confuse all these messages because they take everything so literally and so extremely. They take this idea of free range parenting to mean that you should never intervene with your children when they need your emotional support. So you do want to let them do things on their own, do their homework on their own, go to the store and get a loaf of bread for you. You want to let them do things on their own, but you don't want to confuse that with being absent when they need you emotionally, because children need their parents to help them straight through adolescence, and adolescence doesn't end until 25.
Right,
Help them to process emotions.
right.
Children are not born with the ability to regulate their emotions. They learn it from you. So if you as a parent can't regulate your emotions, then they don't learn to regulate their emotions. And if you are not present enough for them to help them to regulate their emotions from 0 to 25, and I mean, even through 25, your
Yeah.
22-year-old will call you and say, oh my God, I lost my job and I don't, and they need you to help them. So, free range parenting doesn't mean, well, handle it on your own, son. No, 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 no.
Right,
And
right.
so, that's we've lost the nuance in society to understand the difference between letting kids do their laundry on their own, make their bed on their own, do the dishes, those kinds of things, which are, learn how to write a check before they go to college. Doing things on your own is different than processing your emotions on your own.
Yeah, are you familiar with, Dr. John Gottman's work, on, "What Am I Feeling?" It's an amazing book, that, As a family therapist, I often get to recommend and did so today. Do you agree with his assumption that naming emotions and helping children to describe them and identify where they might manifest in the body is a
Absolutely. I mean, reflection and mirroring of emotions is the cornerstone to ego development. So if you don't recognize a child's feelings and articulate it and put it into words, then they don't learn to articulate and identify those feelings. And they also don't feel seen. Unless someone looks at us straight in the eyes and sees our distress and can reflect how we feel, not cheer us up, not be discrepant. So, the idea of
yeah,
baby sad and the mother looks at the baby and goes, "Blah, blah, blah," and has to have the baby be happy all the time. That's called discrepant emotion, right? We don't want discrepancy. We want
right.
mirroring. And so that's critical to ego development.
I have a situation I see in couples therapy where I was recently talking to one of my clients about his ex-wife, and when his 9-year-old son is talking to his mother to try to describe his feelings, she's saying, "Oh, no, you don't feel that. That's not what you feel.
Right. And
You
that's
feel this."
that's dismissing a child's emotions. And as soon as you do that, what you do is you say to that child, "You do not exist. Only I exist. You do not exist." And so recognizing and acknowledging a child's emotions is tantamount to recognizing that child and their existence and their value. And so, yeah, that's called narcissism. When you do that, it's a narcissistic behavior. No, you don't exist. Only I exist.
I realize this is probably in space drone's eye view of things, but one of my concerns has been a culture of narcissism where self-absorption is becoming increasingly more and more normalized and deepened within the culture itself. And I was wondering if you could discuss, like, how do parents who want to resist these types of pressures on society from technology and social media, how can they be sort of thoughtfully engaged in a way that could perhaps make sense to their kids?
I would say get help yourself. That would be the first thing I would say, that when parents are healthy, their children tend to be healthier.
Hmm.
And as you say, we have a culture of narcissism, and it seems to be the buzzword of the day. I've written a white paper for a conference I'm speaking at in London on just this topic. So to the rise of narcissism and what it can be attributed to, but also the rise of narcissistic disorders. So
Yes.
we went 120 years ago as a society from neurotic, what we call hysterical symptoms, to really more personality disorders and narcissistic symptoms. So what
Mhm.
happened to society that changed everything, right? So in Freud's day, we know we had a lot of repression, sexual repression, all kinds of repression, because society was so kind of restricted in terms of what you could say, what you could do, what you could feel. So it caused a lot of neuroses and a lot of hysterical symptoms. Today, because of this selfishness that we raise our children in, because of feminism, because of the me generation, which all was about me, 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 and forgot that societies are based not on me, but on we. And it caused the collapse of relationships. I mean, that's what we're seeing is essentially the collapse of intimate and family relationships and the collapse of individuals. Because if you have a narcissistically inclined patient, you can see the pain it causes them. It
Yeah.
causes eating disorders, it causes
Right.
alcoholism, it causes drug addiction, it causes
Yeah.
gambling addiction. I mean, you basically have individuals who you'd say they're like stuffed animals without the stuffing.
It's like limbic capitalism also. We now have socially acceptable businesses that are explicitly designed to promote and exploit vice.
Right.
Like Ashley Madison, for example. I have a client who spent his life savings on 4 strange women, broke his wife's heart. He's in therapy 5 years later because of his narcissism. And the notion of a society that's ramping up its narcissism for parents who can recognize that and wish to resist against this, outside of the ham-hocked sort of trope of like, a technology-free room, which I sometimes talk about on my blog, or some sort of reduction in screen times or whatnot. It's kind of hard to fight directly against that which is so addictive.
Mm.
And
Well,
the idea of capitalism that is designed to addict.
I mean, addiction is a narcissistic disorder. But, I would say capitalism is a piece of a very big puzzle,
Mm.
a lot of pieces to that puzzle. And certainly capitalism plays a role in that. And as you say, capitalism, feminism, it all pushed for people to have hard driving personal ambition.
Do you see feminism, second wave, I assume is what you're speaking about, is something that installed a new type of ambition in American women that they could enjoy roles beyond that of a mother or a spouse?
Well, and that was the good part of it. Women should always have choice, so should men in terms of, do they want to have a career? Do they want to have children? That wasn't the issue. It was meant to give women choice. But in fact, what it did is it went from one oppressive society to another oppressive society. It just swung from one kind of oppression to the other because it then told women that unless you go out to work, you are not valuable to society and you're not valuable to the feminist movement. And you are, again, so if I'm saying that you look at children and you reflect how they feel, many women felt a very strong instinct to nurture because it's an evolutionary mammalian response to having young is to feel an instinct to nurture. We've killed that instinct over the last 3 or 4 you can kill an instinct, which is really interesting. So it took thousands of years for mammals to have instincts to survive and only 3 or 4 generations in humans to kill them. And we need the instinct of feeling preoccupied with our young. We need the instinct of feeling guilty when we leave. That means our egos are functioning and our instincts to help our young to survive and be healthy is working. So we've told women that they should leave their young, put them in group care. They'll be just anybody can take care of your young. And the most important thing is to ignore your instincts and go out. It's like saying to someone who's broken their ankle, ignore the pain. And after a while, yeah, if you keep ignoring the pain, you stop
Yeah,
feeling the pain. But
yeah.
you also now are damaging your ankle permanently. So, we've really done a number on women because, again, it went from one oppressive society where men were oppressing women to a society where women were oppressing women and didn't give women the choice to have children, raise them, and for that to be acknowledged and recognized as critical and important work in society.
So that brings us back to the notion of expanding, what human life means, because we don't tell, high school women, now, if you go to college and get a career and get a job, the demands in certain fields will be such culturally that having a child would be difficult. For example, you might wanna avoid law. You might wanna be concerned about medicine, for example, as a field. I was, I have a degree in labor studies, so I'm fascinated about, like, love and work and those dynamics there, and women were sort of at first attracted to the freedom of men to be out in the workplace, but then somehow the culture just shrank to the point where they both had to work.
Right,
What an interesting coincidence that happened to be.
right.
And so now you have a situation where, and I didn't understand this the way you explained it to me, which is kind of terrifying, is don't count on the resilience of human instincts. We
No,
can screw that up pretty quickly. We can screw that up in half a century, give or take.
absolutely.
Wow, can you say more about that?
We can talk about it from the perspective of our hormones, right? So again, our hormones help us to function, they help us to regulate, they help us to nurture. Our hormones are so important for so many things. But neurotransmitters require receptors. So if you think about oxytocin, which is the love hormone, a
Mhm.
neurotransmitter that is produced when women give birth, breastfeed, and nurture their young. And it makes their behavior sensitive and empathic. They're very
Yes.
tuned and vigilant to baby's distress. I'm going to soothe my baby. I'm preoccupied, makes mothers preoccupied with their babies, which is
Right.
very healthy. What we know is that when a mother produces a lot of it and she nurtures her baby, then the baby produces a lot of it. So it's like a pitcher, it's like baseball. It's like the mother is pitching the oxytocin to the baby receives it and then pitches it back to the mother. It's like playing catch with the baby with oxytocin, right?
Wow.
What we know is that the more oxytocin a mother produces, the more sensitive, empathic, and nurturing she is, the more the baby's receptors bloom. We have these receptors, which are like the catcher in a
Yes.
baseball game.
Right.
Right? The
Right.
mother's the pitcher, you got to have the catcher.
Right.
If you don't have the receptors, you can't catch the ball, right? You can't catch the oxytocin. So when a mother nurtures, she makes the baby's brain light up and the receptors go, ooh, all the oxytocin's coming. Give me more, give me more, give me more. Now, what we know is that if the mother doesn't nurture, has, postpartum depression, leaves the baby in daycare 8 hours a day at 6 weeks, old, that baby, those receptors don't get turned on. And so that lack of receptors means that baby has less capability of catching the oxytocin. Now, that's passed down generationally. So, Michael Meany did research to show that mothers who licked and groomed their young, this was animal research, but
Right.
mammal research as we are mammals,
Right.
mothers who licked and groomed their young passed down resilience to stress in their young. Mothers who didn't lick and groom didn't pass down the resilience, but also found that the mothers who licked and groomed their young passed down the ability to lick and groom their young. So
Wow.
if you don't have those receptors, you can actually over generations through generational expression minimize the receptors in the
Er
brain. Pass
Erica,
down the inability to catch the oxytocin.
what happens to us 50 years from now? What kind of culture what society are we going to have when we're not catching oxytocin anymore?
I don't wanna think about it.
Yeah. I don't
I
wanna think about it
don't
either.
wanna think about it because, I don't wanna think I'm an optimist, and I would say that I believe that this can be turned around, and I'm 60, so let's say I have another 30 years of having a brain and a voice enough to run around the world and talk about this, and maybe you can too, and we can all as therapists do what we haven't done before, which is become public figures because we've been so afraid to come out publicly to say things that are obvious to
Yeah.
us.
I
And maybe it's our responsibility as clinicians to say what is obvious and what makes people feel bad, because therapists are not used to saying things that make people feel guilty because they want to alleviate people's guilt. Whereas I don't see guilt as a bad thing.
well,
I
what I
see,
like about what you're saying is you're saying that, when you have, for whatever reason, a social order that simply isn't human and does not function for humans,
right,
to have a apparatchik and infrastructure for mental health and nutrition and everything else to try to make it work is stupider and sillier than going back and saying, "No, humans need certain things, and we've designed societies that preclude that."
yeah,
And we can prove to you that we can first inhibit and then extinguish ordinary human love and care.
right.
And then we've lost the ultimate social bond, the family unit. And
That's
there
right.
we've lost a neighborhood and we've lost a society. I can see why you're not wanting to think about that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want my audience to know about this you haven't talked about already?
I mean, there's a lot, but I would say we've talked about a lot, and it's hard to digest this because it's uncomfortable for people to have to think about this.
Yeah.
So I would say we've talked about a lot.
I was wondering if the possibility of being able to have an observing self, if that's one thing that parents could instruct the children, say, "Oh, just notice how your feed changes when you start liking things," or Notice what comes up for you when you see something or when something is phrased a certain way to understand at least somewhat of the mechanics of how one is being manipulated. But perhaps that's a little bit too ambitious for where we're at right now.
Well, I mean, it's in the same line of thinking that parents need to reflect how their children are feeling. I would say that parents can't do that for children if they aren't themselves aware.
Right.
So you have to be healthy as a parent, emotionally and mentally healthy.
And this is becoming an area in mental health that's attracting, I think, more research and more attention with books like yours that talk about those two critical periods of time, the first 3 years of life and then the teen years, and how these are areas of life where parental focus and curiosity and engagement could be vital for the development of their children. Erica, thank you so much for meeting with me today. I learned a lot, and I hope to learn more from you in the future.
Thank you, Daniel. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.